Okay. Okay, so hello everybody, good afternoon. My name is Boaz Atzili. For those who don't know me, I'm a professor at the School of International Service in American University. And I have the honor to be moderating this discussion today with Nadav Shelef about his new book, Homelands. So I want first to thank the Political Violence and Security Research Cluster at SIS and Joseph Torigian, who's leading it this year, for organizing this talk, and the SIS Research for helping as well. So Nadav Shelef is a professor of political science and the Harvey and Meyerhoff professor of modern Israel studies at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Professor Shelef's research and teaching focus on nationalism, territorial conflict, religion and politics, Israeli politics and society, and Middle East politics. His current project focuses on understanding how homelands change, how nationalists demobilize, and the consequences of using military to respond to the pandemic. He's the author of two books. The first of it is called Evolving Nationalism. I don't know. Okay. So I see Evolving Nationalism, Homeland Identity and Religion in Israel, 1925 to 2005. It's a fantastic book. Read it if you can. And the second book is the one that we're going to talk about today. And that's here. If you can see it with my virtual background, called Homelands, Shifting Borders and Territorial Disputes. So I have a really short comment about the book, and then we'll pass the mic to Nadav, who will talk about the book for about half an hour, and then we'll take questions from the audience, and Nadav will answer. Yeah, so basically, I think it's a terrific book in many ways. I want to briefly highlight two ways in which it's, I think, a really important book. So first, this book is one of the rare works that takes constructivist view of reality, yet manages to measure it in a robust and generalizable way across a large set of cases. So that's no small feat, and there are not too many scholars who can do that in such a good way. Second, in many students of nationalism who agree that the nation, and by extension the homeland, is socially constructed phenomena, and I think that's pretty much the consensus among students of nationalism. They also tend to think about the process of this construction as driven by, in many ways, manipulated by elites. In this book, Nadav shows that this is not necessarily the case, that oftentimes the changing shape of a homeland is a result of unintended consequences or side effects, if you will, of a political process, and not something that elites necessarily intended to last for very long. But we're going to hear much more about it, I'm sure. So I'm going to pass the virtual microphone to you, Nadav, and you can share your screen so everybody can see that as well.
All right, thank you, Boaz. I assume you can hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. So with that introduction, I guess I don't have a lot left to say. I've about covered the points I was going to make in the talk. I appreciate you having me to give this talk. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, and I'm sorry I can't see the participants, so I recognize many of the names in the audience. So it's wonderful that you're here. I appreciate you taking the time. So like Boaz said, I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about some of the main arguments that I make in the book. And this project kind of started where my last one ended, which is the book on Israeli nationalism that showed various changes over time in that context. And one of the questions that I got repeatedly, and I think reasonably, is how far I thought that theory extended, right? Or was it just something kind of weird about Israel? And so then I set about to try and find a way to answer that. And as I was sort of looking for a way to do that, right, I came across sort of these repeated instances where ideas about the homeland changed over time. All right, and so you see, for example, here is right, another example from the German case, one that Boaz knows well from some of his earlier work, that shows different depictions by the same political party, right, the German CDU, of what the homeland looked like over time. Right, so you look starting up still in 1953, right, with the CDU quite strongly advocating for the reunification of the entire German homeland, where they included not just West Germany and East Germany, but also the lands that were ceded to Poland and the Soviet Union and the Tsar territories that France was in control of at the time. Still in 1980, right, the CDU is labeling all those areas, not so much the Tsar anymore, since the Tsar was already incorporated into West Germany by then, right, but labeling all of these areas as part of the Germany that they sought to, or that they would ideally control. It's only 1990, right, concurrent with the collapse of East Germany and the unification of East and West Germany, that the CDU changes the shape of what it articulated as the extent of the German homeland. And so in lots of contexts around the globe, we see this kind of change over time. And I became increasingly sort of aware of the need to try and explain how these changes occurred, and to see if we could pinpoint whether or not they had any effect on all sorts of phenomena that we might be interested in, not least of which international conflict. And so that's what I set out to do in this book. And broadly speaking, as Boaz highlighted, I make three arguments in the book. Right, the first is that homelands matter. This may seem to be a kind of trivial argument. It's certainly lots of people acknowledge the importance of homelands, but lots of research on international conflict ignores it or leaves it out of the analysis on the assumption that it's epiphenomenal or is simply the result of cheap talk and sort of rhetoric of one kind or another, or that it can't be measured effectively, and so we're going to say we kind of wish we could get at it, but we can't really, and so we're going to push it aside. In the book, I argued that not only do homelands matter, but that nationalist homelands are a particular kind of homeland. In fact, I argue that nationalism creates homelands in a sense quite different from what we might think of as ethnic homelands, or what geographers call cultural regions. That nationalism creates the imperative for a group to control a particular territory and makes the control of that territory an integral part of who the nation is and what it ought to be, doing. This infuses homelands with a particular value, right? It sacralizes them in ways that, for example, some experimental evidence shows is quite analogous to the way in which the kind of values that religious believers imbue literally sacred ground, right? And so, and this value is, in a sense, in their heads, right? It's ideational. It's distinct from any material component of the land, any strategic value of the land, and it's distinct from the demographic composition of the land. So our nationalism can call a homeland into being whether or not there are co-ethnics on that territory. And in fact, there's quite a bit of variation as to whether or not that is the case. So this idea that homelands matter carries with it sort of two implications, right? If homelands matter so much to their adherents, presumably they'll structure domestic politics in those cases, right, where they exist. And in fact, we do see those kinds of concerns, right, in the case studies that I have in the book. And the second is that they should be implicated in international conflict, right? Losing homeland territory, we would think, ought to lead to conflict if it has this value, and by the same token, regaining that territory, right, should ameliorate conflict. This also has implications for using partitions as solutions for various kinds of conflict, where partitions divide a group's homeland. We might expect them to fail. Where they don't, they might succeed, right? And so that's sort of one part. That's the first leg of the argument. But as great a value as homelands have to their adherents, right? Homelands, like any other component of nationalism, are liable to change over time, right? If nationalism is constructed, if it's contested, then we might expect it to change over time, just like all the other dimensions of nationalism are liable to change over time. And indeed, homeland territoriality can be withdrawn from territory, right, on occasion. We saw in the German case, right, after 1990, even the center-right CDU no longer applied homeland territory to the areas that once were such an integral part of their homeland, just a few years earlier. Even the source of the word for expansionist states, right, in English, irredentism, comes from the Italian desire for their terra irredenta, right, the land in the Istrian Peninsula, right, that they sought to include as part of their homeland. Even most Italian nationalists today don't include those areas of Slovenia and Croatia in the Italian homeland when they speak about it. So if homeland territoriality can be withdrawn, right, if the claim that this land is ours as a function of the nationalist enterprise, if that can change, and we can stop categorizing land as that way, that means that we should treat homelands as a variable, right, and not a constant over time. So there are lots of data sets out there that have a homeland variable, but most of the time, territory is categorized as homeland or not, and it doesn't vary over time, right? But again, taking this idea of nationalism as homeland territoriality seriously sort of impels us to treat it as a variable. Now, in practice, there are two dimensions of change that I talk about in the book. The first, and the one that I hinted at through the use of the maps, has to do with the geographical contours of the homeland. Right, and we can actually look at particular parcels of land and say, and code them, right, so whether or not groups consider those as part of their homeland, and see when that stops or when it starts up again. And this is the dimension of change that I spend some time looking at sort of cross-nationally. The other dimension of change has to do with the logic with which homeland territoriality is applied to particular territory. And this is something I investigate much more so in the case studies, and I'm now working on a sort of separate project to see how far that we can push that to include it in a sort of larger context. But here the idea is that different logics by which we lay claim to, or which groups lay claim to territory, have consequences. So for example, we might say that a particular territory is ours because it has co-ethnics on it, right? And we want to unify the nation. Or we might say a particular territory ought to be ours for historical reasons, right? Now those kinds of claims have very different consequences, right? Historical reasons never change, right? If we, on the other hand, if we claim a territory because our co-ethnics sit on it, if there's ethnic cleansing and our co-ethnics no longer populate that territory, that claim becomes much harder to sustain. And indeed, as I show in the case studies, the particular logics used, even logics that make sense in an earlier time period, right? And those logics that underlie the nationalist claims, they in some cases come to trap groups into being unable to continue to make those particular claims down the road. And the final argument in the book, and this is sort of carrying through some of the issues that I found in my first book, is that homelands change as often as a byproduct of domestic political competition, right? That is, that groups rarely, but this does happen, but they rarely set out to say, you know what, that claim of the homeland was just wrong. Actually, that area isn't part of our homeland, so we're going to change how we talk about it. Because these things mean so much to nationalists, they do that quite rarely. Much more often, they do it as a consequence of trying to meet some other short-term goal for which they're willing to make what they think of as temporary modulations, and that those modulations, if they are subject to political returns over time, become much harder to abandon. Now, this has a couple of implications for how we think about homelands or how we integrate them into our analysis. The first is that ideally, we would situate analysis of homelands and what they do and their impact at the level of the movement articulating the claim to the homeland and not the entire state or the entire nation. That turns out to be quite difficult to do, and even I do that in the case studies, but have yet to be able to do that in a systematic, large cross-national setting. So there's lots of work to do there as well. But it does recognize that there is the domestic variation matters, right? That different groups inside societies can claim territory for different reasons and can claim or can assign homeland territoriality to different areas, right? And it's sometimes as a result of those differences that change comes about. Now, of course, there are lots of other explanations out there for how change could happen in homeland territories. Perhaps one of the sort of most common is just that time works to do it. Time heals all wounds. There are lots of variations of this, arguments about generational change and generational replacement. Right? As new cohorts grow up in a new circumstance, they're simply used to different things, and so their worldview differs fundamentally from that of their parents. We might think of sort of what I group here as world historical events, that there's something about different eras, right? Boaz is here, so I should have labeled this border fixity instead of territorial integrity, right? But there's something about the world in a particular era, right, that affects how how the folks living through that area see the homelands. I put globalization in the same basket, right? That there's something that if territory matters less as countries become more firmly integrated into the global economy, right? Maybe that changes systematically how they view the homeland, or the likelihood that they would withdraw homeland territoriality from a particular area. There's also an argument about regime institutionalization, right? It's a relatively persuasive argument that young regimes, right, are looking to solidify their support among the population, so they might be more apt to claim territory. And so as they institutionalize, they may become less inclined to do so. So all these sort of imply a linear movement, right? The more time passes, there will have some systematic change in how homelands are considered. There are arguments about information, right? Either that folks will just adapt to the new border. A particularly common expectation is that demographic change will lead to a change in the consideration of the homeland, or there could be new information about the material value of the territory, right? So all of a sudden, territory is valuable because it has oil on it, or what have you, and then it gets included in the homeland, or it stops being valuable for those reasons, and so then it's easier to exclude it from the homeland. And then there's a whole suite of what I label kind of instrumental considerations, all of which are real and all of which matter, and all of it explains some things, right, that have to do about the elite incentives and what they face in terms of shaping the homeland. Right? All of these are plausible. All of them carry something, but as I'll show you, I think they all miss the impact of politics. In particular, the argument of ethnic outbidding, I actually think has it backwards. I'll show how that plays out down the line. All right, so how do I go about doing this in the book? The book's divided into two parts. The first half deals with 3 case studies, right? I start with the German context, which is especially useful for testing a lot of these, at least the plausibility of a lot of these alternative explanations in a context that had multiple losses of homeland territory, both, as I mentioned, right, it had lost the Saar, West Germany lost East Germany, or what became known as East Germany, and what had been known as East Germany before the GDR existed, which is the lands east of the Oder-Neisse rivers, right? So East Prussia and the like. But they also had significant domestic variation between the main political parties in West Germany about which lands they claimed and at what times, right? So when immediately after the war and for a good 15 years, there was very little daylight between the CDU and the SPD on the shape of the German homeland. In fact, the center-left SPD was even more hawkish on territorial issues than the center-right. Right? In the early 1960s, that flips, and the SPD starts to sort of moderate its stance, including eventually under the leadership of Willy Brandt, at least formally ceasing to claim the lands east of the Oder-Neisse rivers, but they continued to seek unification with East Germany. So there's lots of variation there that we can try and map to the various explanations of change. I spent some time on Italy, not only because it gave us the term irredentism, so this should be a sort of an interesting case, but the partition of Trieste, right, and the Italian loss of that territory that led to the word irredentism is such a successful case of partition and of a country coming to terms with the loss of homeland territory that it's invariably excluded, or almost invariably excluded, from all considerations of partitions. Right? We just don't think of it even as a partition. But in fact, at the time, this is where the CIA thought that World War III would break out, right, as a result of this territorial division. And so it's kind of curious, so what happened in that context. And then I also spent some time talking about the Palestinian context, in part to see if the same kinds of mechanisms that shape changes in homeland territoriality more broadly also apply in a non-state context, which is important if we're thinking about conflicts involving self-determination movements and what they might settle for and the like. And the short story is, yes, right, the same kinds of processes apply there too, but the Palestinian case highlights the contingency of homeland transformations, right? The transformations can start, but unless they continue to generate domestic positive political returns, those changes will fade. All right. In each of these case studies, right, we can explore them because the plausibility of the arguments for change, because each of those arguments has particular observable implications for who's going to undertake the change, when that change is going to take place, and the consistency of that change by that actor, right? And I'm happy to talk more about this if people want. All right. The main lessons that I took from the case studies, right, is that homeland politics can structure domestic politics, that there's lots of variation in these cases in views of the homeland and in the logics of legitimation that are used, and those are quite consequential domestically, and that the consequences of domestic political contestation offer, at least in these cases, a better explanation for the historical details of how change happened. And particularly interesting here is that despite our assumption that ethnicity drives a lot of these changes, in fact, the literature on irredentism assumes that states want to expand their territory because of the presence of co-ethnics on the other side. I actually find in both the Italian and the German context that ethnicity only started to matter after it became a common logic of legitimization used to claim territory. So the timing there doesn't correspond to lots of our conventional assumptions. All right, and as I mentioned, one of the lessons from the Palestinian context is that change requires, the institutionalization of change requires continued domestic returns to the change, that it's not automatic, right? It's not going to be this automatic reaction or updating to new information, or the like. But these are, after all, just case studies, or not just case studies, but case studies, right? And there's always some limit into what we can do with those to try and draw more general conclusions. So I complement this with an examination of all of the cases of lands left on the other side of an international border drawn between 1945 and 1996. They had to meet a few other small criteria, so not every single, in terms of size and the like, so not every new international border is in the data set. Most of them are, right? And so I look to see effectively when a group stopped talking about that territory as part of the homeland, right? And I have a detailed argument in the book that I'm happy to talk about here, why this kind of discursive labeling of the homeland territory is a good way of knowing whether or not a group thinks the territory is part of its homeland. And so then I sort of undertake a survival analysis of how long does it take after losing territory that's part of the homeland to stop seeing it as part of the homeland, and what could account for that variation. And doing this shows a number of different sort of lessons, occurs a number of different lessons for us. So here we just see a histogram of all the cases of how long or what proportion of time that they're in the data does a particular case have an application to of a homeland territoriality to lost homelands. And the interesting thing here is that roughly similar proportions of the cases, roughly 20% of the cases, have sort of never another application of homeland territoriality to lost lands. That is, these are the cases where they do seem to just adapt to the new border and come to terms with it. But a similar proportion of cases, also about 20%, never give up, right? That is, every single year in the data, right, they affirm the homeland territoriality of that land, right? So this is like China claiming Taiwan, right? Every opening of a new mall in China includes some statement looking to the unification of China and Taiwan, right? And so both of these those very common stories in the literature both have some purchase, right? But there are also lots of cases in between, right? And so just sort of reaffirms the need to explore this variation seriously. And so here's one way of doing that. This is a figure showing the baseline hazard rate, which we can think of as the risk that a claim to lost territory would be made in a particular context, assuming that that case has been under observation for that length of time. And there are basically two lessons to take here, or one actually major lesson to take from here, which is that change is not monotonic, right? You think about those alternative explanations, all of the changes that are based on time, right, would expect a decline over time, right? Very few of them can come up with an explanation of why we have this sort of surge after 26 or so years in the likelihood of a claim coming back, All right, so this is kind of surprising, at least from that perspective. It corresponds quite closely to the way scholars of territorial conflict have, or to observations of scholars of territorial conflict, who've argued that conflict can lay dormant for many, many years and then just all of a sudden reemerges, right? And we're not really sure why, right? So this at least shows that when it comes to claiming homeland territory, you have a similar kind of pattern. So I see I'm sort of running out of time. So to make a sort of a long story short, right? The main, or one of the main factors that shapes whether or not territory continues to be claimed, I show in the book, and consistent with the argument that there's something about domestic political competition that matters, is being a long-lived democracy. The longer you are a democracy, right, the less likely you are to continue to claim territory over time. And so we see here, when you're a relatively new democracy, right, in fact, corresponding to arguments that maybe there's something about regime institutionalization that does capture part of the story, you're relatively more likely to make a claim. But as you are a democracy for longer, right, you become less and less likely to make those kinds of claims. And the marginal impact of being a democracy for longer declines over time. So by the time you're a democracy for 30 years, you're incredibly unlikely to continue to lay claim or to categorize territory that you've lost as homeland territory. Here's another view of that, which is sort of just think about this as a view of the dosage effect of being a democracy for longer. The top line, right, are authoritarian regimes, right, which are significantly more likely to claim lost territory as part of the homeland than democracies for a decade, or democracies for 20 years, or democracies for 30 years. And the gap between them, right, shrinks over time, again, reflecting the declining marginal impact of being a democracy. And just to sort of conclude, all this will kind of be interesting, but not really meaningful if it didn't have an impact on outcomes that folks who may not be interested in homelands for homeland's sake, right, would care about. And so here, I showed that on the figure on the left, that continuing to apply homeland territoriality to lost land shapes the probability of conflict, in fact, at about almost to the same extent as having prior conflict, right? And so it is a meaningful, quite a meaningful shaper of international conflict. The figure on the right, shows that as time passes since a state laid claim to lost homeland territory, the less likely they are to have armed conflict over that territory. So consistent with the sort of starting assumptions, right, or starting implications, right, we do see that both claiming homelands, or claiming lands as part of the homeland, and withdrawing that homeland territoriality from those territories does shape international conflict. All right. So this has a number of implications for us, or for students of conflict and of nationalism. First is that homelands can change, and that this change matters, right? And so this is just another, I guess, plea for those of us who are engaged in large and quantitative analysis of international conflict of various kinds, and especially in territorial conflict, to include a variable as to whether or not that territory in a particular year, right, is considered part of the homeland. And I provide data, at least for a good chunk of the second half of the 20th century, for that. I also showed that homelands are more likely to change, not in response to these sort of automatic triggers, but as a quite contingent process of domestic politics. And so that the more competition you have in a society for longer, the more likely groups are to stop claiming lost lands as part of the homeland. To note, this is exactly the opposite of the expectation of arguments based on outbidding of one kind or another. They would expect the more competition you have to have more sort of fringe elements claiming, that would continue to claim lost lands. Now, what I actually find, at least in this investigation, is that we have the opposite. And then finally, this suggests another sort of pathway for the operation of democratic peace, right? That is, it's entirely possible that democracies become more peaceful, at least vis-a-vis under other democracies, because they stop claiming lost land as part of the homeland. And this removes one of the biggest and most recalcitrant triggers for conflict that we have around the world. All right, I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Nadav. So I think if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A, and I'll read it from there. And I'll start with one question until people come up with their own question. So Nadav, this book is focusing on territorial, at least the case studies, but I think also the large N study, territorial retraction of homeland. People getting to think about the territory as smaller than it, or the homeland territory as smaller than it was before. But historically, we know that expansion of homeland territory is possible as well. Let's just one example. U.S. Like 150 years ago, most people in the U.S. would not think about California as part of their homeland, probably, but they do now. I mean, not everybody, but there are some people that would rather California not be a part of the homeland, but they do now. So, do you think that this is a coincidence, or do you see this kind of expansion notion of homeland coming back? I know that it's not part of the research in the book, but what's your thoughts about it? I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. So there are lots of examples of expansions of homeland territoriality and of applying it to new land that wasn't included. We can talk about California in the United States, but there were attempts to include sort of Guam and the Philippines, sort of way out beyond the continental United States. So lots of those examples. I didn't focus on those primarily because I found them less interesting, right? That is, we can understand why a group, once they're in control of territory, would assert that it's part of their homeland, right? That is, it's sort of costless to get more territory, right? And so I think that's lots of reasons to expect that to happen. So I focused on the harder cases, right? Of you lost something, right? That you really cared about, and so when do you stop caring about losing that? I kind of think about it in terms of kind of like smoking. It's a lot less interesting to study why people start smoking than why they stop, which is a lot harder than starting. So that's what I do that. Now, that said, I think that the processes of expansion may follow similar processes, right? That it's a politically contingent process. And I can imagine arguments inside a society about whether or not those territories really should be included in the homeland. Just a case that both Boaz and I know quite well. Like, so in Israel, there's an argument about whether or not to include the West Bank in the Israeli homeland. And some people focus on the land and say it's part of our homeland no matter what. And some people say, well, there's a cost, right? We don't want to include the Palestinians in the homeland as part of our territory, and so we're willing to let it go, right? So I can imagine those same kinds of arguments about expansions would take place as well.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I have some questions. The first is from Anonymous. How has the influx of immigrants and refugees from heightening world events potentially affect our perspectives of homelands?
So it's a good question. You know, I guess I would want the anonymous to sort of follow up to understand better what they're getting at here. I think that to the extent that nationalism continues to drive the way lots of folks around the world see and understand what happens in the world, that you're not going to see a particular change in these kinds of dynamics. That homelands will continue to be important. To the extent that nationalism declines, right, the importance of homelands will also decline.
Thank you. Okay, second question from Krista Wagan. Hi, Krista. Krista saying, great talk. How much does your argument challenge the research on how governments with larger winning coalitions, selectorates, are more vulnerable to unpopular foreign policy choices, especially choices about giving up territorial claims?
Yeah, well, it suggests that it's not, at least to me, that it's not the size of the selectorate that that matters. It's the kind of competition that they're engaged in and the length of competition that they're engaged in. One of the things, or one of the ways in which change happens here, and just use an example from the German case, is the substitution of something else that the country or that the selectorate of that country really cares about for the homeland claim, right? So homelands matter a great deal, but nationalists want other things. They want sovereignty, for example, or they might want, are willing to give up part of the homeland for unification with another part of the homeland. So Adenauer, in the early years of the West German Republic, resisted explicitly claiming lots of the other territory and acting about it. In fact, was castigated by the SPD for not acting to unify the homeland, because he said, if we do that, right, the Western powers won't give us real sovereignty, and we have to have real sovereignty first. So real German patriotism, right, is not pursuing unification, it's pursuing sovereignty, right? So he's engaging in kind of rhetorical coercion there. Kohl did the same thing in the 1990s in 1990 for the folks who said, you're giving up on the claim to the Oder-Neisse territories. How could you do that? Kohl said, we can continue to go for those territories, but then we lose the ability to unify East Germany, and that's more important, right? And he was able to switch the focus of the argument. So I think that anyway, there are more dimensions here to the sort of the focusing on the size of the coalition. I know in both of those cases, I think quite significant, or they were very firmly in power, right? So there's no real alternative to them, at least in the Democratic arena.
So if I can have a short follow-up on this, can you say a little bit more about what kind of coalition or political dynamics in some of your cases, so for instance in Germany, lead to this change in attitudes in different parties?
Right. So there's some variation here, right? So for example, the SPD went from being, just in shorthand, territorially hawkish to territorially dovish because they were losing, right? So in the late 40s and early 50s, the SPD was afraid of becoming a permanent minority. They couldn't break the 30% threshold in national elections. And so they engaged in a whole host of tactical changes and ideological changes to get at this. Most of them had to do with moving closer to the center on economic terms and on convincing the German public that they would remain firmly in the Western orbit. But part of it involved muting their claim for reunification, right? And so in order to contest politics more successfully. Local elections, that's what they did. That enabled the kind of change that Willy Brandt would push through, right? Where they would engage in a very explicit trade that Kohl actually carried out of the lands east of the Oder-Neisse for unification with East Germany. For Kohl, that change happened a little differently. That change happened in part because the CDU had always maintained that the reason that those territories were German had to do with sort of international legal reasons and the rights of the population in a particular territory to decide where they lived, and the people there would obviously choose Germany if given the chance, right? And so 1990 comes along, right, and the Berlin Wall falls, and solidarity movement in Poland takes over, and it turns out that Poland had and the people living there had no interest in joining Germany, right? And so the legs on which the CDU's claim to those lands were just much weaker, right? And so they found themselves unable to make those kinds of claims anymore. So those kind of changes happen. We see similar kinds of tactical political calculations in the Italian case, in the Palestinian case, and in my earlier work in the Israeli case as well.
Thanks. Question from Jean Meyer. Would Mexico be would have lingering concerns about the loss of California? I guess it was triggered by my own question.
Sure, there are some. They're very, very marginal. But one of the lessons that comes up, would be sort of implicit in that upturn over time, is that it is entirely possible for a Mexican nationalist to come up and try and make their platform by saying, we want to sort of recapture our homeland territory from the United States. That, I think, is unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely because other things also matter, right? That is, power matters, right? And the United States is significantly stronger than Mexico, and that's likely to shape what affects the prospects of politicians in Mexico as well. I should note, as power changes, right, those things could also change. So, Finland lost homeland territory to the Soviet Union, right, and then was quiet about it, and then for some reason in 1991, right, those claims emerge again, right, when it became maybe possible to do something about them, and then they die down once it becomes clear that Russia would replace the Soviet Union, and Russia wasn't going anywhere, right? So other things also shape the incidence of these claims as well. But I would bet that as soon as it became politically profitable in Mexico to make those claims, then that we'll see them. We'll see mobilization for it.
Great. This is a really interesting question from Robert Adcock. Now that you have looked at Homelands in a broader population of cases, how has your thinking about your original case of Israel changed? Does the Israeli case turn out to be a relatively typical of patterns seen elsewhere, or does it appear to be a deviant case when situated against a broader population of cases?
So, hi, Robert. It actually seems to be completely typical. Right. In fact, I was kicking myself had I been smart enough when working on the first project to sort of look a little more broadly. Right. I could have had all these other great cases, right, where the very similar kinds of stories exist. So it at least for me affirmed the claim that I make in that first book, that Israel is not particularly unique, at least in the treatment of territory.
Next question is from Min Kim.
Yeah.
Fantastic book and talk. I know this is out of your scope, but I was wondering if your argument may travel to contraction and expansion of maritime territoriality.
So it's a great question, Min. And you're right, I don't do this. I'm willing to, I think, to sort of go on a limb and think about maritime territoriality as different. Right, at least different in most cases, right? So my argument is that homelands have this value for nationalists because the territory becomes seen as part of who the group is, right? And as part of their homeland. And so there are relatively few cases that I can think of around the world where sort of these tiny islands, right, are seen in that context, right? Now, it doesn't mean that they can't acquire. In fact, I would note, most of them are not even included in my data because they're too small, right? I have a sort of size constraint of 100 square kilometers for the sort of amount of territory before it enters my my data. So lots of those things could become embroiled in it. There's lots of reasons for conflict over them, but I don't know. And the application of territoriality still works that way, but I don't know that they become necessarily seen as part of the homeland in that case. And so if you think about sort of the arguments in the South China Sea, right? So Taylor-Farvel actually shows that China is willing to compromise about all sorts of, with the exception of Taiwan, right? All sorts of territorial disputes, right? That of one kind or another, right? Including, as I imagine he would say, of the maritime kind. But I think I do think that the application of territoriality and its withdrawal happens in those cases too, right? And may follow similar processes or it may not.
Thank you. Christiana, is it possible to allow somebody to ask the wrong question? We have a question from Veronica Library, which is longer and more complex. So it would be good if you can allow her to join us, but maybe I'll ask a question meanwhile for Nadav. This question about the case of Germany. We have in Germany, in a sense, a really interesting puzzle that we have, or I guess almost potentially a natural experiment when we have West Germany, a democracy, and East Germany, a dictatorship, authoritarian regime, both of which had different ideas about homeland. What do we know about the attitudes in East Germany at, let's say, early 1990s about the territory east of the Oder-Neisse, and to what extent these attitudes was similar or different to that of the West Germans?
So we should know anything that we say about public opinion in East Germany, we should take with a grain of salt, right? Because it's very hard to do good public opinion research in East Germany at the time. I can tell you certainly at the elite level, right? East Germany came to terms with the loss of the lands east of the Oder-Neisse much faster than West Germany. And it did so quite clearly in response to pressure from the Soviet Union, right? And so very quick, so again, if you look at sort of East German textbooks or other kind of banal representations of the homeland, they sort of very quickly give up on those territories. In fact, they start talking about them as being liberated by Poland and Russia from German occupation, right? And this happens very, very fast. And so when at the point of unification between the GDR and West Germany, West Germans were actually much more interested in the lands east of the Oder-Neisse than East Germans were, right? Who are focused on unification with West Germany.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting case to look at, because it's basically dictated by an outside power, and how it something that would be interesting to look at is public opinion polls in East Germany in the early 90s, for instance, if we have these after they no longer have to say what the government tells them to say. Anyway, next question. So Veronica, please ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wasn't expecting to be heard, but hi Boaz, hi everyone. So I know this is a little bit probably outside of the scope of what you're looking at and engaging with. At the same time, you were talking a bit about the contestations, between the groups, and given the countries you're also talking about, the history of the colonial project, I think, is very important to thinking about land expansion and possession of the territory. And so my question, looking at colonized homeland versus colonizer state as homeland, right, is how is homeland itself, the perception of and concept of, also reliant on the interplay between the possession of land and homeland, which goes along with dispossessing specific people of their homelands, right? And so thinking about what's happening now in the US, indigenous peoples have this kind of sub-state sovereignty in which they're only allowed to claim a very small portion of their homeland because the rest of their homeland, which is still their homeland, right, has been taken away from them. And at the same time, you have extremists who want to claim homeland as kind of, this is something we conquered, this is something we have earned, and want to intentionally erase specific types of peoples and groups from homelands in order to claim those. And so thinking about the expansion of land, indigenous peoples, colonization, and how all of this also impacts the perception of homelands and borders and territory over time as well.
So that's a very big question. It sounds like it's a great sort of entirely distinct, sort of related, but a project in its own right. So I have a couple sort of maybe disconnected thoughts about here. First, that I don't actually think that the indigenous tribes, groups in the United States, so it's sort of known as tribal sovereignty, is actually sovereignty. And so I think that if it were, we'd see a much stronger reaction from the United States. And so that where there's a conflict between them, usually the American nationalism wins out, right? And says these are still parts of the United States. And so it illustrates exactly the process that you point to, right? Which is that the creation or ensuring or promoting American control over these territories, the nationalist American impulse prevents other groups from having sovereignty over that territory. I think that's accurate. I think that's true of all nationalisms, right? That is, nationalisms abhor another group having control of that territory. The other part I would point to, though, is that you don't actually have to be in control of a territory to think that it's your homeland, right? Or to have these cases. It's true of mobilized groups for indigenous sovereignty in the United States. It was true of the Zionists before the establishment of the State of Israel. It's true of Palestinians, right? And so it's true of the expellees in Germany or in Trieste who pined for the return of to those territories. And so there is a relationship between possession of the territory and sort of its inclusion in the homeland, but it's certainly not linear, right? In fact, it's not necessary, right, for the creation of the homeland. I do think that you pointed that there'll always be a fight, right? Wherever there are groups who want to include the same territory as part of the homeland, I would expect conflict.
Yeah. So on this positive note, always expect conflict. The time is 5, so unfortunately we have to end the conversation. Thank you so much, Nadav. It's been fascinating. And if you have a chance, read the book. It's really interesting, both, I would say, the case studies and the larger study that generalize them. So get the book, read it, and thank you everybody for coming. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Boaz. Thank you, everybody.